A school gymnasium converted into a meeting hall. Folding chairs arranged in rows. 30 parents waiting for the evening's parent-teacher conference to begin. A teacher steps to the front to address the room. Before he finishes his second sentence, a security officer grips his arm and walks him toward the exit in front of every parent and every child still lingering near the snack table. 40 minutes later, the principal would stand in that same gymnasium and tell the entire room something that would change how the district handled school security for years afterward. Marcus Webb had taught 8th grade history at Roosevelt Middle School for 11 years, long enough that he'd started teaching the younger siblings of his earliest students, a fact that quietly delighted him every September when a new class roster arrived and a familiar last name appeared on it. He ran his classroom with a particular philosophy he'd developed early in his career. History wasn't a list of dates to memorize, it was a collection of decisions ordinary people made under pressure, and his job was to help 13-year-olds understand that they too would someday be the ordinary people history quietly depended on. He kept a small bulletin board near his classroom door, covered in postcards former students had sent him over the years. Proof, he liked to joke, that at least a few of his lessons had actually stuck. His students adored him in the specific way middle schoolers reserved for teachers who took them seriously without ever losing patience, and parents requested him by name during scheduling season more than any other teacher in the building. He'd been nominated for the district's Teacher of the Year award twice, losing both times to colleagues he genuinely believed deserved it more. A gracious response that had become something of a running joke in the staff lounge about Marcus's apparently bottomless reserve of humility. That evening's parent-teacher conference night was, for Marcus, one of the year's most important events. Not the individual 15-minute meetings scheduled throughout the building, but the opening assembly in the gymnasium where department heads addressed the full parent body about curriculum changes before everyone dispersed to their individual appointments. As department head for social studies, Marcus had been asked to open the evening with a 5-minute overview of the year's history curriculum, a responsibility he took seriously enough that he'd rehearsed his remarks twice at home the night before, reading them aloud to his wife in their kitchen until she'd finally laughed and told him the room of parents wasn't going to be nearly as tough an audience as she was. The district had recently contracted with a new private security firm to staff evening events at several middle and high schools, following a string of unrelated incidents at a different campus across town, a policy change implemented with good intentions but minimal coordination between the security firm and individual school administrations regarding staff recognition. Roosevelt Middle School's evening security coverage that night fell to Officer Tyrell Banning, a contractor on only his 3rd assignment, still working from a printed roster of authorized staff that, due to a clerical oversight during the district's recent system migration, had failed to include several teachers hired or promoted within the previous 18 months, Marcus among them, having been elevated to department head only that fall. Banning had been given a brief, generalized instruction before the event: monitor entrances, verify staff credentials against the roster, and flag any unrecognized adult moving with apparent authority near the podium or stage area. Language specifically intended to address concerns about unauthorized individuals attempting to address school assemblies. Nobody had explained to him that the roster itself was incomplete, a gap that would prove consequential within the first 10 minutes of the event. Banning, eager to perform well on only his 3rd assignment with the firm, had decided privately, before the evening even began, that he wasn't going to be the guard who let something slip through on his watch. Marcus approached the small podium set up at the front of the gymnasium a few minutes before the assembly's scheduled start, greeting a cluster of parents near the front row, several of whom he recognized immediately, and exchanged brief, friendly small talk with about their children's progress that semester. He carried a small stack of index cards with his prepared remarks, dressed in the same blazer he wore for most formal school events, his school identification badge clipped to his lapel, exactly where it always was. Banning, working from his incomplete roster, didn't recognize Marcus's name or face from his brief list of approved presenters for the evening, a list that, in fact, hadn't been updated to reflect Marcus's new department head role at all. He approached as Marcus reached the podium, stepping directly into his path with the deliberate, formal posture of someone executing a specific instruction. "Sir, I need to see identification before you address this group. Of course, Marcus said, already reaching for the badge clicked visibly to his lapel, mild confusion crossing his face at the request, given how plainly the badge was displayed. I'm Marcus Webb, Social Studies Department Head. I'm opening tonight's assembly. That's not on my list, Banning said, glancing down at the printed roster in his hand without acknowledging the badge Marcus had just offered for inspection. I need you to step away from the podium until I can verify this. I've worked at this school for 11 years, Marcus said, a note of genuine bewilderment entering his voice now, his eyes flicking toward the gathering audience of parents who had begun to notice the exchange unfolding at the front of the room. My badge has my photo and my employee ID number right on it. I think there might be an issue with whatever list you're working from. I'm not authorized to let unverified individuals near this podium, Banning said, his tone hardening into something more rigid, more procedural, the kind of tone someone adopted when they decided the situation required firmness rather than flexibility, regardless of what evidence was being presented to them. I need you to come with me while I sort this out. Sort what out? I have my school ID right here. Marcus held the badge up more directly now, his patience visibly thinning, the first ripple of real concern entering his expression as he registered Banning's hand moving toward his arm rather than toward the badge. A parent in the front row, a mother named Diane Castellano, who had 3 children who passed through Marcus's classroom over the years, stood up immediately. Excuse me, that's Mr. Webb. He's been teaching here for over a decade. What is happening right now? Banning didn't acknowledge her. Sir, I need you to come with me now. Before Marcus could respond further, Banning's grip closed firmly around his upper arm, beginning to walk him away from the podium toward the gymnasium side exit, the sound of folding chairs scraping against the floor rippling through the room as dozens of parents turned to watch, several already rising from their seats in open confusion and alarm. This is unnecessary, Marcus said, his voice carrying clearly across the now silent gymnasium, the index cards with his prepared remarks slipping from his hand and scattering across the floor near the podium. I have not done anything except show you my identification. Please let go of my arm. A boy near the back of the gymnasium, one of Marcus's current 8th grade students who had stayed to watch his teacher's presentation, called out his name in a voice that cracked with confusion and growing alarm, the sound cutting through the murmuring crowd in a way that made several parents visibly wince. The realization settling over the room all at once that a child was watching his own teacher being physically led away in front of everyone he knew. Banning continued walking Marcus toward the exit, radioing for assistance with a tone of clipped, satisfied authority, apparently unmoved by either the badge he'd been shown or the rising tide of parents now standing and openly objecting to what they were witnessing. Got an unauthorized individual attempting to access the event, escorting him out now. Principal Renata Alvarez, who had been in the hallway outside the gymnasium reviewing final logistics with the front office staff, heard the commotion before she fully understood what was happening, pushing through the gymnasium's side doors just as Banning reached the exit with Marcus still firmly in his grip. What is going on here? Her voice carried instantly across the room, the particular sharp authority of someone who had spent 15 years running a building full of adolescents and had long since perfected the art of commanding immediate attention. Removing an unauthorized individual, ma'am. He wasn't on my approved list, Banning said, his grip on Marcus's arm still firm. Alvarez looked at Marcus, then at the security badge still clutched in his free hand, then back at Banning with an expression that several parents later described as somewhere between disbelief and barely controlled fury. That is Mr. Webb. He is the head of our social studies department. He has taught at this school for 11 years. I personally promoted him to department head 4 months ago. Release him immediately. Banning released Marcus's arm, stammering something about an incomplete roster, his earlier certainty collapsing rapidly under Alvarez's direct, unwavering gaze. Marcus straightened his blazer, rubbing his arm where Banning's grip had left a faint mark. His composure visibly strained, but holding the index cards still scattered near his feet where he hadn't yet had a chance to gather them. Alvarez didn't immediately address Banning further. Instead, she turned to face the full gymnasium, The entire room of parents and lingering students now watching her in complete silence, the energy of the room shifting entirely under the weight of her presence at the front of the space. "I want to address what every single person in this room just watched happen," she said, her voice steady but carrying an edge that made clear exactly how seriously she intended to treat what had occurred. "Mr. Doughty Bow. Webb has dedicated 11 years to this school. He has taught hundreds of your children. He was removed from the stage in front of all of you because a security contractor was given an incomplete list and chose to physically restrain a man who showed identification rather than simply verify it through any one of the dozen staff members standing in this building right now who could have confirmed his identity in 10 seconds. She paused, letting the silence settle over the room before continuing, deliberately giving the moment the weight it deserved, rather than rushing past it toward whatever logistics the evening still required. The room remained silent, several parents nodding slowly, the mother who had stood up earlier visibly close to tears at the front row. Alvarez asked Marcus directly in front of the entire gathered room whether he felt able to continue with his prepared remarks. Marcus, gathering his scattered index cards from the gymnasium floor with hands that hadn't quite stopped trembling, nodded and returned to the podium, delivering his 5-minute overview of the year's history curriculum with a composure that several parents later said they found genuinely remarkable, given what had just happened to him moments earlier. He spoke, fittingly, about a unit his classes would be covering later that semester on moments throughout history when ordinary people had to decide, in real time, whether to stay silent or speak up against something they witnessed happening in front of them. A topic he hadn't planned to frame quite the way he ended up framing it that night. The parallel to the room's own silence and Diane Castellano's intervention, clearly not lost on anyone listening. Alvarez, meanwhile, pulled Banning aside, confirming his employment details and contacting the security contracting firm's on-call supervisor directly from the hallway, her voice audible through the partially closed door to several staff members nearby as she outlined, in precise and uncompromising terms, exactly how the evening's protocol had failed, and exactly what she expected as a corrective response by the following morning. Word of the incident spread through the school community with the particular speed unique to parent group chats and neighborhood social media pages, several attendees having recorded portions of the confrontation on their phones, footage that, combined with Alvarez's own pointed remarks to the room, painted an unambiguous picture of what had occurred. Within hours, a local parent had posted a brief clip to a community forum with a caption that simply read, "This happened tonight at my kid's school," a post that accumulated hundreds of comments before the night was even over. By the following morning, the district superintendent had been briefed directly, and within 48 hours, the security contracting firm had issued a formal apology to both Marcus and the school, acknowledging that an incomplete staff roster, a direct result of a rushed system migration the firm hadn't adequately verified before deployment, had created the conditions for the entire incident. Banning was reassigned away from any further school placements pending a full review of the firm's onboarding and verification procedures across all of its educational contracts district-wide, a review that, according to people familiar with its findings, ultimately identified gaps affecting roughly a third of the firm's active school assignments. The district's school board held an emergency session the following week, specifically to address the incident, with Alvarez herself testifying about exactly what had happened and what she believed needed to change structurally to prevent any teacher, staff member, or visiting parent from experiencing something similar in the future. Marcus attended the session as well, offering measured, thoughtful testimony that focused less on personal grievance and more on the broader pattern he believed the incident revealed about how quickly assumption could override basic verification when institutions failed to communicate clearly with the people responsible for security. Several board members later said his calm, deliberate framing of the issue had shaped the policy discussion considerably more than a more emotional account might have, lending the proceedings a tone of constructive problem-solving rather than defensive damage control. The district implemented a sweeping policy overhaul within the month, requiring any security contractor staffing district events to receive a verified, updated staff roster, no less than 24 hours before any event, cross-checked directly against the district's own human resources system rather than relying on documents the contracting firm maintained independently. The policy additionally mandated that any security staff member encountering a credential dispute contact a building administrator for immediate verification before any physical removal could occur. A procedural safeguard that, had it existed that evening, would have resolved the entire situation in under a minute. The superintendent's office also commissioned an independent audit of every security contract across the district, identifying 2 other schools operating under similarly outdated rosters before any further incidents could occur. The district's security contract with the firm responsible for Banning's placement was placed under a formal 90-day review period, with several board members publicly questioning whether the relationship would continue beyond that window depending on the firm's demonstrated improvements. The firm's leadership, facing the very real prospect of losing one of its largest regional contracts, responded within days with a revised onboarding protocol requiring every contracted guard to complete a building-specific orientation, including a current staff photo review, before their first solo assignment at any new campus. Alvarez, for her part, instituted an additional building-level safeguard at Roosevelt specifically, a laminated photo directory of all current staff, updated each semester, posted directly at every security checkpoint for evening events, ensuring that even an incomplete external roster could be cross-referenced immediately against accurate current information maintained by the school itself. She presented the idea to her fellow principals at a district-wide meeting the following month, and within a semester, nearly every middle and high school in the district had adopted some version of the same simple, low-cost solution. Marcus didn't pursue any formal complaint against Banning individually, telling Alvarez and the board that he understood the failure as primarily systemic rather than personal, though he made clear he expected the structural changes to be real and lasting rather than a temporary response to public attention. He returned to his classroom the following day, his students greeting him with a level of concerned attention he found both touching and slightly overwhelming, several of them having already heard fragmented versions of the story from older siblings or parents before he'd even finished taking attendance that morning. One student, normally one of his quietest, stayed behind after class simply to ask if he was okay. A small gesture, Marcus later told his wife, had affected him more than almost anything else that entire week. He used the moment characteristically as an unplanned teaching opportunity, opening a brief, age-appropriate classroom discussion about institutional failure, assumption, and the importance of verification before action, concepts directly relevant to the history curriculum he taught but rarely illustrated quite so immediately and personally for his students before. Several students, he later noted with some surprise, connected the incident on their own to a unit they'd covered earlier that year, about ordinary bystanders who'd intervened during moments of historical injustice, drawing the parallel to Diane Castellano standing up in the gymnasium without being asked. Diane Castellano, the parent who had stood up first that evening, later became one of the loudest community voices advocating for the district's new verification policies at subsequent board meetings, telling a local reporter that watching Marcus get physically removed from a stage in front of his own students' families had been the moment she realized how easily institutional carelessness could escalate into something far more damaging if nobody in the room was willing to stand up and say something immediately. She and Marcus stayed in touch in the months that followed. An unlikely friendship formed entirely out of those few tense minutes in a school gymnasium neither of them had expected to define their relationship to the school community going forward. Roosevelt Middle School's next parent-teacher conference night, held the following semester, opened without incident. Marcus delivering his department's curriculum overview from the same podium, his school badge kept in the same place it always had been, though this time a laminated photo directory sat clearly visible on a small table near every entrance. A quiet, practical reminder of exactly what had gone wrong the last time, and exactly what the building had decided would never be allowed to happen again. Alvarez, watching from the back of the gymnasium that evening, later said it was one of the few moments in her career where a policy change had felt less like paperwork and more like something the entire building community had genuinely earned together. This story is a reminder that even 11 years of trusted service can be undone in an instant by a system that fails to communicate the basic facts of who belongs in a room, and that the difference between a quiet correction and a public humiliation often comes down to nothing more than someone, somewhere, taking 10 seconds to actually verify before acting. For Marcus, the lesson eventually settled into something quieter than anger. A renewed appreciation for the small, easily overlooked systems that, when they work as intended, never make the news at all. If this story moved you, hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to see it, and subscribe for more true stories of justice finally catching up.